Hello and welcome. Today, I would like to talk about fragility in different nations, different countries. Why do some countries become what is known as fragile states? In Lucky for us, there's a new book entitled State Fragility, Business and Economic Performance in Ethiopian Perspective from my colleague, Dr. Belay Seyoum. Dr. Belay Seyoum has agreed to be our guest lecturer today. So I will ask him some questions about state fragility and the insights that he can provide for us as policymakers, as academicians, as researchers, to make our nations a little bit better than they currently are, especially if they are considered to be fragile states. In his book, Dr. Seyoum offers a multidisciplinary analysis of state fragility. The book offers insights from fragile states that have overcome instability through high economic growth and greater equality for all their citizens through inclusionary strategies. Dr. Seyoum also outlines the role of entrepreneurship in economic growth and poverty alleviation within fragile states. The growing number of countries with weak capacity to carry out basic governance functions is leading to unacceptable high levels of human suffering around the world. So this book discusses the multidimensional nature of state fragility, and also it highlights the non-political factors that tend to drive state fragility. Based on the institutional theory, Dr. Seyoum explores how weak institutions become a source of state fragility by undermining social cohesion in the broader economic progress of various countries. Dr. Seyoum also examines the role of entrepreneurship in industrial policy as a means of creating and sustaining economic as well as political stability, trade policy as a means of increasing income and easing tensions, and also technology policy as a means of engaging people in entrepreneurship as well as innovation. So the book appeals to academic researchers who are interested in international business, to economic and business policy professionals, international trade and emerging market leaders that want to know how fragile states can promote sustainable peace and development in their nations. The inability of states to perform for the benefit of their populations has been a matter of concern for citizens in the wider community for many decades. The case of fragile states that are in crisis and lag in social as well as economic development has created a real sense of urgency to find constructive ways to improve their situation. In 2023, as a matter of fact, more than 100 million people were on the run from conflict and from crisis. Imagine 100 million people trying to secure a better life or a better city for themselves by running away from conflict and crisis associated with state fragility. Armed conflict is pushing a growing minority of the global population into a deeper crisis, unfortunately. For example, the armed conflict in Ethiopia and Somalia have resulted in untold suffering and hardships for millions of individuals. It destroyed lives and livelihoods, it devastated infrastructure, and it disrupted international supply chains in trade, which impacts not just the nations that are fragile, but also others that are trying to benefit from global trade. So conflict and instability have led to limited supply and skyrocketing inflation in food and fuel prices all over the continents. Let us reflect on better understanding state fragility from an expert who just wrote a textbook about this topic in 2024. So let us ask Dr. Belay Seyoum some of these questions now. Dr. Belay Seyoum, thank you for being here to talk about state fragility and human development, which focuses on Ethiopia. To start off, I would like to ask you, what is state fragility?
State fragility is a condition in which a country is unable to fulfill the basic functions of a state, such as providing basic services, such as schools or power, or water, similar things of that nature, actually. And when you look at fragile countries, uh, you also see certain patterns, certain characteristics, and that's the fact that they are poorly governed states, right? And they often experience political instability, including armed conflict. And you find that armed conflict is both a cause and a consequence of state fragility. Now, uh, although we talk about state fragility as a permanent something that happens to countries, but it's not really a permanent condition because countries move in and out of fragility as their policies change and so forth. So it's not a permanent condition. And the other thing I would like to mention is that although many countries uh, have problems of fragility, sometimes some advanced countries have it, some developing countries also face problems of fragility. But scholars agree that fragile states are those where the problems have gone to such an extent that it threatens stability in these countries. And I think that is the thing about fragile states. Now, one other point I would like to state is that since the end of the Cold War, ethnic conflict has replaced ideological disputes as a dominant factor of conflict, as a dominant factor that is igniting conflict. Now, they are difficult to settle, especially when they're ethnic, religious based conflicts. They are often very difficult to settle. And multi party politics uh, tends to exacerbate these problems. Rather than mitigating these problems, it tends to exacerbate the problems. And I think this is what many of the studies indicate.
Okay, so given the fact that fragility is a moving target in states change, how do you measure state fragility?
That's a good question. Now, state fragility is multidimensional. It's what you call a multidimensional construct. And generally, it describes countries that are deficient in one or more of the core functions of a state. Now, I would like to explain what these three core functions are. Now, these are broad categories. And one of them is actually authority. In other words, for example, you could ask a question, are there competing claims to the monopoly of violence in the country? Because a defining characteristics of a modern state is that the state alone has a right to use or authorize the use of physical force. Now, in fragile states, there are competing claims to authority, and therefore there's use of violence by state actors, by non-state actors, and I think that is one of the issues there, the question of lack of authority in fragile states. Now, the second area is capacity. Now, does the state lack the political will or the ability to provide basic services such as security, health, education that promotes overall development? Now, the third area that we could look at is legitimacy. Now, is the state or the government accepted by the people as legitimate, or it uses repression to achieve obedience? So that's how we measure fragility in a broad perspective. Those are broad dimensions of fragility, basically.
Okay, given that, are there specific indicators that have been developed to measure state fragility?
That's right. That's right. Yes, there have been various approaches have emerged to measure different dimensions of fragility. Now, they have been developed by different agencies, by different organizations. Uh, I can mention the names of some of them. For example, there's what they call the State Weakness Index, the Political Stability and Absence of Violence Index, or the Global Peace Index, so, and a few others. I think there are about 4 or 5 of them. But for this study, I actually used what you call the Fund for Peace Institute Index. Now, the Fund for Peace is an organization that had developed various indicators that are largely comprehensive. And they also use what you call quantitative and qualitative data, and they triangulate that to come out with a ranking and a country score. And I think the book actually uses this measure when they analyze, they discuss state fragility. There are also detailed indicators that have been developed by the Peace Institute, and I would like to mention a few of those. The indicators, the what we call the specific indicators by the Peace Institute are actually 4, right? The 4 indicators are: one is what you call the cohesion, whether the country has a sense of unity and harmony index or indicator. Okay. Now, the cohesion indicator measures, for example, security. Okay, the extent to which there is sufficient security to protect the population, and the extent to which the government is, for example, terrorizing the opposition or the public and so forth. So that would be one measure. But another measure of cohesion indicator is, for example, the extent to which there's factionalized elite. For example, factionalized elite means, is there a power struggle along ethnic lines, along religious lines or clan lines? The other indicator on cohesion is there a group grievance? For example, are there divisions between different groups in society for access to resources or for services? So this is basically one, what you call a cohesion indicator. The second indicator that the Peace Institute developed are what you call economic indicators. Now, economic indicators look at, for example, the extent to which there is an economic decline in the country, inequality in incomes or within society. Are there opportunities for class mobility, right? And they also look at the economic impact of human flight and brain drain. Okay, so these are the economic indicators. The third one is what we call political indicators. Now, political indicators looked at, for example, state legitimacy, public services, the level of human rights and rule of law. That's the third indicator. And then the final indicator is what we call social indicators. Looks at refugees, the number of internally displaced people within the country, and the extent of international external intervention. To what extent other countries, for example, involve themselves in the affairs of a given country, right? So these are some of the specific indicators that are being developed by the Fund for Peace. The 4 indicators: cohesion, economic, political, and social indicators.
So, given that, why should we study state fragility? Why is it important to study it? And more importantly, perhaps, who are some of the people that should be studying state fragility?
I believe it's a very important area to study because of a number of reasons or a number of factors. One is countries that are impacted by fragility are prone to conflict and crisis. Okay. Moreover, there is also a recurrence of violence. Violence is not a one-time situation, but it happens again and again. And for example, since 1990, many of the statistics indicate that there have been recurrences of earlier conflicts in many countries. So that's one reason why it's important to study. Now, the other factor probably is that, for example, if you look at the data in 2015 alone, only 5 fragile countries generated over 60% of the 15 million refugees. You see, And last year in 2023, over 100 million people are on the run from conflict. So obviously, these are some of the major reasons why I think it's an important area to study state fragility.
Now, in your textbook, you do mention the case of Ethiopia. And why did you choose Ethiopia for state fragility example?
Thank you for your question. Yes, Ethiopia is a very interesting country because it's a country with a rich history. Its unique civilization, for example, goes back to the second millennium BC. And also, it's the only country in Africa that was never colonized and with its own indigenous alphabet. And it's also a founding member of the League of Nations, the founding member of the United Nations. So really, when you look at this rich history and rich civilization, uh, you basically wonder why it's grappling with fragility and conflict. And I think this is one of the reasons why I thought Ethiopia would be a pretty good study. Uh,
So, given the fact that you're using Ethiopia, where you were born and raised, and you have a lot of knowledge because you have written so much about them, and you travel back and forth from United States all the way back to Ethiopia, would you consider Ethiopia as a fragile state?
yes, I actually took me a while to really look at the data to see really whether it's a fragile state. But unfortunately, it is a fragile state. If you look at the data for 2023, which was last year, Ethiopia ranks in the bottom 11 of 178 countries with a fragility score of 100.4. Okay. And it's a score, actually, the worst part of this is also it's a score on group grievance. For example, group grievance is 8.9 out of 10. It's a score on factionalized elite, with the elite that are factionalized, for example, is 9.3, which is very high. Okay. Now, also, if you look at this average fragility score since 2006 is 97.8. Now, 97.8 puts the country under what the peace index of the alert status. We're almost approaching the failed state due to the country's fragility in many critical areas, right? Now, when you look at this score, you also wonder, because the score came out about maybe 6, 7 months ago. So sometimes this score probably is even better than what is going on right now, because it does not reflect, in my opinion, it doesn't reflect, for example, many of the demolitions, the expulsions of over 500,000 people from the city. It does not also include some of the kidnappings for ransom that have taken place over the last 4 or 5 months. And so the point is that this data actually represents what you call an alarm bell for the government and the government and its institutions to take appropriate measures, because this data basically shows that it's inching closer to that of a collapsed state like Somalia or even Yemen, or that it's not yet there, but it's almost approaching that. And also, it has a poor score on, for example, it's poor score on group grievance, uh, refugees, internally displaced people. They have actually a poorer score than Somalia, which has been a fragile state for years. Okay. Uh, so these are some of the reasons why I feel Ethiopia is a fragile state at this point. Now, uh, once you are a fragile state, it doesn't necessarily mean that you remain so. The government takes appropriate measures. You can always get out of fragility. It's not, as I said, a permanent condition. People have done that. Countries have done that over the years.
So that's certainly good news that there are avenues to strategize and eventually transition out of this fragility. But before we get to that question, in terms of your recommendations, what do you think are the fundamental causes of state fragility in Ethiopia?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are probably about 5 or 6 areas. I don't think we have time to go through them, but I can just mention them in terms of what they are. One of the fundamental causes of state fragility in Ethiopia is the existence of factionalized elite and ethnic politics. That's one of them. Because we can explain that, but we don't have the time now to go into that. The second one has to do with ethnic federalism. An ethnic federalism, a constitution that promotes ethnic federalism, and this actually strengthens ethnic differences, creates conflicts among different ethnic groups, and so forth. So that's the second reason, the second cause. The third cause of that is the absence of a strong and visionary leadership in the country that would hold the country together. I think that is probably the third major reason. The fourth one probably would be weak institutions. The weak institutions are actually one of the major factors as well, because in Ethiopia today, the legislature, the courts, the opposition have failed to do they're not really an effective counterweight to a strong executive. So really, it's the executive that's basically running the show, so that the other branches of government really do not have a major say in what's going on in the country. They just follow the executive in doing what the executive wants. And then the other couple of areas is external intervention. There's a lot of intrusion into the internal affairs of the country. Various countries do that. So that could probably be one factor as well. And then finally, in spite of this historic civilization, I think there's what you call the erosion of shared morality. Especially when you look at the violence and so on and so forth, you'd be surprised that the shared morality has kind of eroded over time. So these are probably 5 or 6 reasons why the country remains fragile.
Thank you so much for all those insights. There seems to be a lot of similarities or parallel between Ethiopia and other countries, including my country of birth, Afghanistan, in terms of the reasons why these countries do fall victim to this fragility. Overall, in summary, can you please emphasize the role of education for fragile state leaders that are actually trying to strategize for their countries to get out of this fragility? In other words, what are some of your suggestions or recommendations for states that are in the process or that are wanting to transition out of fragility?
I think there are a number of areas that need to be done in order to get this country out of fragility, and one of them is the need for to have inclusive peace agreements with different factions, because the problem is that there are different factions who are at war with each other. So the only way is basically to have some kind of an inclusive arrangement where everybody can participate. So that's probably one of them. And then the other one is political reform. That political reform includes for a repudiation of ethnic politics, for example, changing some aspects of the constitution that reinforces ethnic federalism, and so forth. And then also improve the quality of the institution. For example, education. You need to have education reform to make sure that there's quality education. There are a number of schools in the country, number of universities, but the quality of education needs to improve. Not just the number of schools. And then finally, of course, you need a strong civil society. Civil societies do have a tremendous role to play in in introducing and reinforcing democratic norms in the country. So you need strong civil institutions. Those are some of the things that can be done.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Belay Seyoum. I hope that the audience can actually get their own copy of State Fragility, Business and Economic Performance that just came out this year in 2024 for greater insights and also to put this into practice for their policies, for the reforms, for inclusion, as you mentioned. So diverse groups within the country can come together actually and be united toward maybe preventing their countries from falling victim to this fragility, or to at least, if they're already there, to get them out in a better state of affairs. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to our next interview.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mashtaba. Thank you very much. State fragility is a condition in which a country is unable to fulfill the basic functions of a state, such as providing basic services, such as schools or power or water, similar things of that nature, actually. And when you look at fragile countries, you also see certain patterns, certain characteristics, and that's the fact that they are poorly governed states, right? And they often experience political instability, including armed conflict.